Welcome he, she, him, her, we, its, and them. I'd like to introduce myself, me. The wise emoji. Collectively we are we and us. Today's episode is in no doubt a controversial selection. Pertaining to arms. Not like arms that animals develop and protrude out of their anatomy, but arms in the sense that as objects are an extension of the body. Today's topic is about such an extension, called arms, applied in context to the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. The wording of arms, in such context, covers a swath of objects. Objects that are protected as a right, without having to mention any specific object as being under the classification of arms. Arms can be throwing stars, swords, bow and arrow, spear, hammer, ladder, bat, wire, rifles, handguns, and so forth. Arms is an object, any object that can be held and reasonably used. They are an extension of one's arms. Firearms is a subject, in which folks are as far apart on as the Continental Divide. A spark of the ongoing debate for and against firearms as an object to be regulated have coined many compelling and passionate arguments. I must take my stance to first point out the Second Amendment was written in the United States Constitution as part of the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. Let's first understand what bill means in the context of law itself. A bill is a formal or public writing or declaration of one's claim against another. The United States Constitution mentions the Bill of Attainder and the Bill of Rights. Both are bills or a formal declaration. One declaration states a Bill of Attainder cannot exist, while also declaring rights do exist. One is restricted and prevented, while the other is a right that cannot be regulated. A Bill of Attainder is an act of a legislature declaring a person, or a group of people, guilty of some crime, and punishing them, often without a trial. A Bill of Rights spells out Americans' rights in relation to their government, who are the servants of the peoples. The commonality between the two are they both are bills. Both are formal declarations among the public recordings of what is prohibited and what is not. In this sense, the prohibition of any Bill of Attainder prevents the legislatures, the judicial, and the executive branch from acting in unison to subvert the rights belonging to the peoples, thus the requirement of the vast blanket of due process. The inclusion of the prohibition of any Bill of Attainder is indicative to restricting the three branches from modifying or changing rights and/or the legal operation of law by crafty wording or overcomplication. In other words, some facets of the United States Constitution cannot be changed. The founders were wise individuals in attempting to protect the newly created United States from themselves, from the potential and most likely subversion of legislative, judicial, and executive fiat. Let's now start by reviewing the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. It is well established by the United States Supreme Court that a state is comprised of the citizens of a particular state. The context meaning of the Second Amendment is the citizens make up the state, and therefore the peoples are the militia. There is no mention nor indication that the Second Amendment was in regards to any United States military. The National Guard is not a militia in the context of the Second Amendment. This is made even more true by the fact the National Guard is fully funded by the federal government. We now understand that a free state is comprised of the citizens of a state, of who also are a militia comprised of the peoples of a state. Having the right to keep and bear arms, for the purposes of protecting the security of a free state. It is then made true the citizens that make up the state has an overwhelming interest in retaining their security. The mode and means of that security is made clear within the Second Amendment. Let's now continue to another aspect of the Second Amendment. Rooted in the Second Amendment is the use of infringed. Again, reflecting upon the intent of the Second Amendment as a whole, let's review the definition of infringed. Infringed is written in both the past tense and past participle of the word infringed, indicating the founders expressed their intentions of never again. Recorded in history are the actions of the British soldiers, who first attempted to seize the firearms from the arsenals. Luckily, the Patriots had insight to remove the firearms before the British arrived. Let's now consider what a well-regulated militia means, in the context of the citizen militia. There is a distinction between the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms, and that of a well-regulated militia, incorporated into those who willingly wish to join a call to arms. Therefore, the right of the citizens to be armed is an established absolute right, while also addressing the need to call up the citizens into a militia status, and by virtue of the ability of the citizens to be readily prepared. A citizen militia is subject to the governor of a state, and therefore a governor is the state commander-in-chief, for the purposes of recruiting and use of the citizen militia, without the citizen being under a specific military service contract. Let's now delve into the aspects of the Second Amendment, and of it being a right. A right does not come with conditions. A right cannot be subject to regulations. A right cannot exist if one is legislatively required to request permission to exercise said right. If a state tells its citizens you must obtain a gun license and/or permit, then it violates the Second Amendment. When a state requires a person to apply for gun ownership, to possess or to carry, then such a person is asking for permission to own guns, to possess, as well as to carry. Asking for permission is regulating as a privilege. It's absurd to accept the notion that one must ask for permission to exercise a right. One cannot be required to surrender a right in order to take on the restrictions of a privilege, in which would otherwise be a right. That would amount to a conversion of one's right. If one submits to the restrictions of licensing, then they are not acting under the Second Amendment, but under the constitutional commands of the Commerce Clause. No state can force a person to surrender their right, hidden under the disguise of a privilege. Nor can a state restrict the right of exercising their Second Amendment right, by legislative fiat, via the regulatory aspects of commerce, unwillingly by a contortion of twisted law. Otherwise, as a constitutional republic, we risk losing all rights, by having them legislated away. As we reflect upon opposing points of view, I must reply, just because a person cares not about a specific right, does not mean that rights should be removed by those in opposition, even of the majority. Nor should a person in the exercise of a right be deprived of said right, based on the willful choice of a trespass made by another individual, group, or entity, acting as a whole, as this reflects back to the prohibition of a bill of attainder. As the person who does value their Second Amendment right, they too may not value the rights of others of a different class, especially that of a minority class. What say ye of a person that values the Second Amendment right, but does not endorse the right of suffrage, or any other right? Shall the majority opposing under the disguise of the dangers of a pure democracy have voice over the minority, while at the risk of losing the remaining protections provided under a constitutional republic, to be surrendered because of an interpretation of one right, having the ability to be far too efficient in causing harm or death? While another may very well argue, they view suffrage as being just as dangerous to the constitutional republic as a rogue murderous shooter. It is logically true that a tyrannical legislature 3 miles away can just as easily trample on one's rights as a tyrant king 3,000 miles away. And while the United States attempted to form a more perfect union, the intent is clear. They understood that merely changing from a monarchy to a quasi-democracy did not change the ability of a tyrant. Democracy in its simplest term is merely a standard of living set by society for society. This standard of living set for society is the standard of the majority, while often leaving the minority to fend for themselves. As a constitutional republic, it gives voice and protections for the minority to speak against the oppression of the majority. Understanding the fragility and tyrannical nature of a pure democracy, the founders attempted to keep democratic elements of democracy in check. Holding democracy to be held restricted and limited as a quasi-democracy is the tyrant's worst nightmare. The one document, the United States Constitution, does just that. It has been a thorn in their sides, and has long hindered their ritualistic addiction to absolute power, a corruption in absolute. Being well educated in global history, the founders knew nothing can be made perfect, knowing that as government grew, so would the arrogance of the tyrant. It was with this being kept in mind, from the shores of Massachusetts to the shores of Georgia, 56 founders signed the Declaration of Independence, and 39 founders signed the law of the land, the United States Constitution. It is now of my duty to logically form a worthy opinion, embedded with passion and with human logic. To ask just 2 questions, and answer both honestly. Should we bequeath our rights and protections, to let them be put off until another day? Or should we bequest them, so that we now, and those later, shall always retain and preserve those rights and protections, in security to ourselves, and for our future generations? Or for perhaps all of those rights and all of those protections, as well as the security of our constitutions, will all be lost in time. It is indeed true the United States Constitution is one of the most sublime documents ever written by human intelligence. It would be foolish to allow it to be taken away, manipulated, misconstrued, to become a carcass, a skeleton of jurisprudence.